We have a right to pleasure. We have a right to pleasure. We've grown up often internalizing this message that we have to put everyone else first. And there's this orgasm gap where men are getting off, but women aren't always. And I don't think we should actually get rid of the orgasm gap. I just think it should be reversed. Because the truth about female desire is that women are naturally insatiable and voracious, and it is possible for all of us to get to this space where we become multi-orgasmic. And I think there is a lot of fear around this for men too. It's, again, this fear of this wild, uncontainable, voracious, it's like, oh my God, that's terrifying because I don't know what to do with that. But it's an invitation for men to actually cultivate sexual stamina and to cultivate this kind of reverence for the feminine and to drop into a space where her pleasure becomes the priority and actually everybody benefits from that. I'm Madeline Eliza. Join me to explore female power, embodied leadership, sensuality and spirituality as we weave together ancient and modern, the scientific and the mythic, the erotic and the divine. Hi everybody and welcome to the show. Today our topic is female desire, which is a topic that has been shrouded in mystery and sort of darkness and often a lot of fear and therefore a lot of control. I want to look at our historical understanding of female desire and the threat that it has posed and therefore the different ways in which it has been suppressed. I really believe that having a deep and loving and profound reckoning with our own desires, not just our sexual desires, but our desires for power and autonomy and agency and self-actualisation as women, I think that this is an essential ingredient to a conversation about female power. So we're going to just crack it all open today. Looking at these historical perspectives, the different ways female desire has been suppressed and kind of considered as something dangerous that needs to be controlled. This is a very consistent theme throughout history. And then in the last 50 or so years, the different ways that female desire has begun to be celebrated and cracked open. I still think we've got quite a long way to go in talking about desire in the mainstream, in talking about the female sexual experience. I want to unpack the orgasm gap. If you haven't heard of it, we're going to be talking about that today. We're going to be looking at a couple of fictional portrayals of female desire and what they say about the societies which they arose from. I think, again, stories have so much power, and I'm really interested in weaving together different perspectives on a topic to get a holistic overview. We're going to look at the way that childhood conditioning impacts often our ability to express our wants, our needs, our desires, our boundaries, our yeses and our nos, and the ways that the studies show this differs between boys and girls. Boys and girls internalize different messages about emotional expression, and I think this is so salient and relevant to our experience as adults and the ways that we struggle to express ourselves and to ask for and to claim that which we want. We're going to be talking about the topic of female sexual dysfunction in more detail, leading on from this conversation about the orgasm gap and all the studies that have been done in that space. It's super interesting. We're going to be talking about female Viagra and really looking at, well, my perspective on where I think we need to be focusing our attention and why this matters. This is not just about having a great sex life. This is about really claiming the fullness of yourself as a woman. And I don't think that we can do that without talking about desire. So let's get started. One of the problems with understanding of female desire is that it has been this kind of mysterious, unknowable essence kind of hiding in the darkness. And if we look at the polarities of the masculine and the feminine, again, drawing on Tantra and the teachings there. And this is relating to the body, but it's more from a spiritual perspective, I suppose. If we look at the womb space as the locus of female desire, this is where it springs from. And there's a lot of science about how the desire circuits are activated between the brain and the body, and the different pathways for male arousal and female arousal. There's a lot of neuroscience there now that is looking at kind of the nuts and bolts of how desire works. But if we look at it from like a zoomed out spiritual perspective, we can't really talk about female desire without talking about the womb space. This is, if you put your hands, I mean, everybody knows where their womb space is if you're a woman watching this, but it's really helpful to get connected to that sacral chakra, which is just above your pubic bone. This is the center for sexuality. It's the center for creativity as well. And the womb is this dark void space inside of each of our bodies, and it is the location for creation and destruction every single month. We often think of the female body as a vessel of creation, and of course it is. We grow life, we birth life, we are a channel for new life to come into this world. But we're also a vessel of destruction. Every month there's death occurring inside of our womb space. There's the potential of life, and every time we bleed, it's a death of a potential life. And I think this understanding of this darkness and this destructive capacity of the feminine is really essential to coming face to face with our own desires. I don't think we can talk about it without acknowledging the darkness that's there. So to draw on Tantra again, if the feminine is like a dark sacred temple, if you like, and the masculine, the lingam, the symbol of the lingam is literally translates to a sword of light. Like the masculine is illuminating this feminine dark space. It's a very beautiful interplay of different polarities. So I think reclaiming that sense of darkness and mystery and this very fine balance, like being on a knife edge between creation and destruction, is a really beautiful and poignant starting place when we start talking about female desire. I don't think we can have this conversation either without really looking in a little bit of detail at the history of patriarchy and understanding what that has meant for women. We've got quite a lot of freedom comparatively now, especially in the West. We've got huge amounts of freedom and autonomy. But for most of the recent past, women have not had any legal rights. Women have not had any financial rights. Women have not been allowed to earn money or to own property. Women are entirely at the beck and call of their husbands. Spousal rape was not made illegal until quite recently. Like, we really have been in a position of subjugation for many thousands of years. And when we talk about desire, and particularly sexual desire for women, and I think this is where this fear kicks in, because of course the upholding of patriarchy and of male control relies on controlling paternity and offspring, and these amazing fertile fecund bodies that we have as women. It's like a precious resource that has needed to be controlled. So our desire represents a threat to men in that context of patriarchy, and of course things have changed a lot in recent times, but I really think that a lot of us have absorbed this kind of conditioning, like this witch wound, if you like, where it's not safe for us to ask for and to claim what we want. It's not safe for us to express our darkness and our rage. And this is all part of the same puzzle of feminine expression and feminine reclamation. And people believe different things about this. I am not so much into the woo-woo side of like, my ancestors are moving through me in some spiritual way. But I think there's definitely a case for epigenetics where these patterns of contraction and fear and needing to color within the lines as a woman so as to not be outcast from your position. These patterns of contraction and fear, I think, are behavioral patterns that are passed down generation on generation on generation. This is kind of how epigenetics works. And I've experienced that in my own embodied experience and in so many women that I've spoken to about this. So even though we have a lot of comparative freedom now and a lot of ground has been claimed for women's rights, a lot of us are still operating in a shell that goes back many generations, where we don't want to rock the boat, and we don't want to be too forthright, and we don't want to be seen as this sort of uncontrolled, wild, hungry, kind of devouring force. There's this mythological creature, a female demon called a succubus, who basically devours men sexually and is really destructive and dangerous. And I think this is, again, like a kind of a story that we have about female desire running in the background. This is the story of Adam and Eve and original sin. Eve's bodily desires and this uncontrollable kind of hunger caused the downfall of humanity. And I think that those stories still carry a lot of power, and it's often a lot of work for us to cast them off, and the shame and the contraction that those stories can hold us in, it can take some time to unravel that and to really have a deep reckoning with our own embodied desires. Over the last 400 years, the Enlightenment in the 1600s through till quite recently, the dominant philosophical thought system has been rationalism, which is also why we're all so bloody disconnected from our bodies, because it's all about the precedence of the brain over the body. I think, therefore I am. Logic rules. It's a very masculine paradigm. And it kind of sets up this binary of the brain and the body, the masculine and the feminine, containment and wildness. And with colonization and the history of colonialism during that period as well, over the last 400 or 500 years, that binary has been set up with the idea of the civilized Western cultures versus the savages, the indigenous inhabitants of the lands that they were colonizing. And, that's still ricocheting around the world today, this false binary and kind of racism, and that goes alongside the sexism against the feminine. So we really need to start to unpack these binaries. And I wanted to share a perspective from the novel Jane Eyre, which was written by Charlotte Bronte in 1847, so kind of almost 200 years ago. And this is really widely regarded as a feminist text. And in some ways it is, but I think to put a modern feminist lens on it, you'd call it a white feminist text. And the character that I think is really interesting when we talk about female desire and this pattern of fear of this voracious sexual feminine that's very of the body and the earth and nature and wildness and kind of uncontainable, versus the masculine, which is more logical and ordered and civilized and of the brain and just a lot more contained. So in Jane Eyre, Edward Rochester, who Jane Eyre falls in love with, has in the attic of his house his third wife, Bertha Mason, who is of mixed race, and she's characterized as the mad woman in the attic. And he refers to her as my Indian Messalina. Messalina was the third wife of the Roman Emperor Claudius, and she is famous for her violence and her promiscuity, these aspects of the dark feminine that we have tried so hard to repress in ourselves and in our societies at large for hundreds and hundreds of years. So Jane Eyre, this great feminist text, has this character really representing the wild, uncontained feminine. And I mean, what greater form of control is there than locking her in an attic? Jane says in the book what a pygmy intellect she had and what giant propensities. Again, there's so many layers of racism and sexism here, but it's this pitting of the body against the brain and prioritizing the brain over the body and the masculine over the feminine. I think it's really interesting to unpack this. In contrast, another fictional character which came about 80 years later is D.H. Lawrence's famous book, Lady Chatterley's Lover. And this was published in 1928. It was only published in France and Italy initially. No publisher in the UK or the US would touch it until 1960. 30 years later, it was so scandalous and so controversial that nobody would publish it. And it tells a story, if you're not familiar with the book. Lady Chatterley is a noblewoman who's married to a nobleman who returns from war and he's paralyzed. So the body versus the brain, he's all brain. And it's not enough for her. she has this hunger of the body, and she has an affair with the gamekeeper, who is kind of working class, and again representing those more base elements, if you like. And what this book did was really chart some of these aspects of female desire that had been pushed under the carpet up until that point and denied. And it kind of held this aspect of the feminine up to the light and validated it in a way that resonated with so many people. Like, this book was like Playboy magazines that were passed around by boys in the 90s or whatever, before smartphones were invented. It was really hot property. And actually, when it was published, finally in 1960 in the UK, the publishers were immediately subjected to an obscenity trial, which they won. But it shows that even then, 30 years later, it was still incredibly scandalous, and I think points to the fear that society has had at large of like the wildness of the feminine and what might happen if we let that out. Like, it has to be remaining contained because it's too dangerous if we lift the lid on it. And this sounds dramatic, but if you interrogate your relationship with your own desires, and I've been really deeply immersed in this work for the last several years, often we have that same internalized fear, and not just around our desire, but like the extremities of the different emotions and the different experiences that we have in our body. There's almost a fear that if we lift the lid and allow that to move through us, that it might destroy us. And it's a really beautiful journey to go on when you can hold yourself through that and get right to the bottom of it all and find that not only are you not destroyed by it, but you become totally lit up and empowered by integrating all of that darkness and all of that wildness. So I think Lady Chatterley's Lover is a really beautiful counterpoint to Jane Eyre and so many other books that have kind of demonized aspects of the wild feminine. Around this time in 1960 was also when the contraceptive pill came out, and the second wave of feminism was kicking off, the women's liberation movement. And there was a book that came out then, and this speaks to other aspects of female desire beyond just sexual desire. So one of the lighthouse books of second wave feminism was Betty Friedan's book called The Feminine Mystique. And the feminine mystique is a term that she coined to describe the assumption that was very prevalent at that time, that women should be happy to be a housewife, and that being defined in relation to other people as a wife and a mother is enough for the feminine. That is where she's happiest. And it's very interesting to see this trad wife movement unfolding now, which is kind of bringing back those Stepford wife ideals of the 50s in many ways. Like, a woman is happiest in the home when she's with her husband and her children. And what Betty Friedan's work was based on was many interviews that she conducted, first with her own college classmates and her peers, and then with broader and broader circles of women, where she really asked them about what they yearned for in themselves. And what she found was that for many women, this idea that we should be happy to just be at home and defined in this way wasn't enough. And they wanted more. And this is not to diminish the experience or the desire of women who do feel fulfilled by that. I think we all have different desires. But at that time, for a woman to desire anything beyond that was totally out of the question. Like, it just wasn't happening. So this was a very revolutionary book, and it really brought this concept of female desire out into the open, and desire for power. Desire to be involved in political life and intellectual life, where women had traditionally been in the home. There's a couple of ancient Greek terms here which I think are really helpful. The polis, which was like public life, and the oikos, which was the life in the home. And this was a binary construct in ancient Greece, where polis was for the men. That was where the intellectual and political life happened. And oikos, the home, was the domain of the women. And often women have been very revered in that space, but there's still this block to women entering public life. So this was all unfolding in the 60s, around the same time that Lady Chatterley's Lover was published. Obviously, we're still seeing that play out today. But I think this is when we started to see the dismantling of this idea of womanhood as a very narrow, like Mother Mary, pure, pious, soft, nurturing, gentle in the home. Like that is the sum total of femininity. And for most of us, we have multitudes within us. Like there is a soft, nurturing part, but there's these many other aspects as well. And there is darkness, and there is wildness, and there is hunger for different things. And when we can reckon with all of that, we become much more empowered as women. So when we become disconnected from our desire, it causes all sorts of problems, obviously. And a lot of this can happen from early in childhood. And if you know anything about trauma, we know that, the body remembers these patterns and we form implicit memories. And we know that children and adults will generally prioritize belonging over authenticity. So if you have to bend yourself out of shape in order to belong with your caregivers and your family, then children will do that 9 times out of 10. That's what happens. And that's how we end up as adults, kind of walking around in these shells that are not really authentic to who we are. And there's studies that show that this bending out of shape happens differently for boys and girls because of the ways that they're socialized. Girls are socialized to be more free to express emotions, especially happiness. And girls are more prone to anxiety and depression, actually, than boys. So expressions of sadness are also more welcome in girls, vulnerability and tenderness, those kinds of things. Girls are socialized to internalize the more difficult emotions like anger and disgust and greed and this kind of darker realm of emotional expression. For boys, they're less likely to express emotions overall. And for boys, they are more likely to externalize problematic emotions, problematic in inverted commas, like anger. Boys are commonly much more comfortable expressing anger. This has been proven in studies from childhood. This is how we're raising our boys, which I think is evident to anybody when you look at the way that our society works today. Boys don't cry, etc. So this pattern for women of holding all of the trickier emotions that we think people don't want to see, we learn this really young, and it can take a long time actually to come into right relationship with our own bodies and with our own emotions. And so we end up in this place where we're fawning and people pleasing. For many of us, that can be a pattern that can be really hard to overcome. And that feeds into the way that we relate to ourselves and our partners sexually as well. And that's the next topic that I want to unpack here when we're talking about female desire, is female sexual desire. This is a really complex topic. Obviously, we are cyclical beings, and there's a lot of research that shows that our desire levels fluctuate over the course of a month, which makes a lot of sense. We also find that female desire can fluctuate with menopause and when you are pregnant and breastfeeding and in those early years of parenthood, and often very depleted in that time. We know that there's lots of things that can cause fluctuations in female desire. And I am talking about this predominantly through a heteronormative lens today. This is my own embodied experience. I am interested in looking at polarity. Again, I apologize if this offends anyone. I'm just stating that as a bit of a disclaimer before I get into this more juicy part of the conversation. So putting these cyclical fluctuations to one side, I really want to look at how we navigate desire in our intimate relationships, and particularly as women interacting with men, because I don't think we talk about this enough. I really don't. And there's a lot of shame that shrouds these conversations, and I'm interested in cracking it all open. So here I am. I want to start by talking about the orgasm gap, and I'm going to read out some statistics here. So this is based on studies of about 50,000 people done over the last few years. I'll put the links in the show notes so you can see all the science. 95% of heterosexual men orgasm every time that they have intercourse. 65% of heterosexual women orgasm every time that they have intercourse. 86% of lesbian women orgasm every time that they have intercourse. And 92% of heterosexual women orgasm when self-pleasuring. So it's not that heterosexual women are not capable of orgasm or that there's something wrong with their bodies. 65% will orgasm during intercourse, and 92% will orgasm when self-pleasuring. So something is out of whack. And I want to talk about this because I then read in this study, and I quote, "The main reason for the orgasm gap then is that women are not getting the clitoral stimulation they need." And this was part of a piece talking about how porn just showcases a lot of really hot and heavy intercourse, and that most women can't orgasm from intercourse. The writer of this study then went on to say when women were surveyed, 96% of women said that the most reliable way for them to orgasm is via a clitoral orgasm, which kind of dismisses out of hand the significance of these deeper vaginal orgasms, of G-spot orgasms and cervical orgasms, which we know from the science can take much longer for women to achieve. And this really pissed me off, actually, this study, because I don't think we should be telling women that they just need more clitoral stimulation and that they probably can't have vaginal orgasms anyway. I believe that all women are capable of having vaginal orgasms, and that these orgasms are much deeper and more profound and really connect you into your energetic and spiritual body in a way that clitoral orgasms often don't. It's like surface level versus going really deep. And I think there's a lot of misinformation out there, and then a lot of shame because we don't want to talk about it. We don't want to talk about our experience versus that of our friends. And so, yeah, I'm here cracking it all open today because I think it matters. I think it's really important. Some other pertinent statistics and a couple of other quotes that I would like to share on ejaculation for men. So for men, the average time to ejaculate from when intercourse commences is 5 to 7 minutes. The average time for a woman to orgasm via intercourse is 14 minutes. So now we start to see why only 65% of women are having orgasms during intercourse with their partners. I think this matters. And again, I don't think we talk about it enough. And that's not even considered premature ejaculation. Like, that's normal. So premature ejaculation is less than 1 to 1.5 minutes after penetration. And when I Googled this, one of the first page results was this website, healthymale.org.au. And there's a quote from a male doctor that says, "Usually ejaculation less than 1 to 1.5 minutes after penetration is regarded as premature ejaculation. But if this causes no distress to either partner, no treatment is necessarily required." I just found this such a complete shutdown of the female experience and what she might be desiring that, again, it really pissed me off. And I wanted to bring it to this conversation, to bring this up to the light. We have a right to pleasure. We have a right to pleasure. We've grown up often internalizing this message that we have to put everyone else first. And there's this orgasm gap where men are getting off, but women aren't always. And I don't think we should actually get rid of the orgasm gap. I just think it should be reversed. Because the truth about female desire is that women are naturally insatiable and voracious. And it is possible for all of us to get to this space where we become multi-orgasmic and where we can keep going for a very long time. And actually, when we can reclaim this capacity within ourselves, it kind of puts the onus on the men in our lives to step up to the plate as well. And I think there is a lot of fear around this for men too. It's, again, this fear of this wild, uncontainable, voracious kind of bodily female figure, like the wild feminine. It's like, oh my God, that's terrifying because I don't know what to do with that. But it's an invitation for men to actually cultivate sexual stamina and to cultivate this kind of reverence for the feminine and to drop into a space where her pleasure becomes the priority and actually everybody benefits from that. I would like to see this conversation and this view of the orgasm gap becoming normalized. And I think if we don't talk about it, we're never going to get there. So I'm just adding my voice to the conversation. There's lots of people doing amazing education in this space, but I want to add my voice to the conversation. So off the back of this, there has been a disorder coined, hypoactive sexual desire disorder, because we love to pathologize things. And if a woman doesn't feel sexual desire, there must be something wrong with her that we can give a name to and call her a disorder and give her medication, because that's how our system works. I will add as a disclaimer, I'm getting a little bit fired up. I have a personal subjective experience with over pathologization and over medication, not for hypoactive sexual desire disorder, but for mental health. So I was diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder when I was 12, and I was medicated with SSRIs, all different SSRIs, on and off for about 15 years. These drugs had all sorts of side effects, from gastric reflux that eventually led to bulimia, to causing heart palpitations and arrhythmias. Like, pretty serious as a 12-year-old. And and I'm going to do another episode on kind of mental health and mental illness and that whole continuum, but I will state that as a disclaimer on this conversation around female Viagra, which is where I'm going next, that I'm coming to this with my own subjective experience around medication and pathologization of really complex conditions. Like, if a woman isn't feeling desire for her husband, there's umpteen number of things that could be going on there. And when we just say, you've got this disorder and here's this medication, there's no opportunity to actually go within herself and uncover what makes herself tick and how she can get back in touch with that desire and reclaim it. So the global female sexual dysfunction market is currently worth about $500 million, and it's estimated to grow to $1 billion by the year 2030. And I'll put all the links to these stats in the show notes if you want to check it out. So it's kind of a big issue. And again, I don't think that we talk about it enough. And there have been a couple of drugs developed over the last 10 years. One called flibanserin, which came out in 2015. And this drug was actually developed as an SSRI antidepressant medication, and it didn't really work, but they found in trials that it did help some women feel more sexual desire. So they decided to rebrand it as a drug for female sexual desire. And it's a pill that you have to take every day. It works very similarly to the way that SSRIs do. Different from male Viagra, which is to do with blood flow between the brain and the penis. Totally different type of drug. And there's another drug called bromelanotide, which came out in 2019. And this is an injection that you have to inject into your thigh 45 minutes before you want to have sex. And neither of these drugs have done particularly well in the market, because the results and the efficacy is kind of patchy, and they're very expensive. Certainly the first one that I mentioned was very expensive when it first came out. So I'm talking about all of this as a way of kind of outlining the state of affairs, the orgasm gap, the way that we talk about female sexuality and female desire, and the way that we treat it. Like, you've got a problem and here's a drug for you to take. And there's lots of people doing amazing work. I'm not trying to say that it's only these drugs that are on the market. From my perspective, this really matters in a conversation about female power, because when we're grounded in our desire, it kind of ripples out to all the other areas of our lives as well. We're able to advocate for ourselves. We're able to get in touch with our yes and our no, with our wants and our needs and our boundaries. Like, what's going on the inside really ripples out to the outside as well. And if you're interested in reclaiming your fullness, I think we need to reckon with our own desire and really lift the hood and look at what makes us tick and what do we want. And there's two pieces here that I think are really important to this process. And the first is trying to work to eliminate shame. So some of these studies that looked at female orgasm rates found that one of the biggest inhibiting factors to women orgasming was worrying about what they looked like, what they smelt like, what they tasted like, what their partners thought of them, what their face might look like when they orgasmed, like this kind of self-consciousness around the body. And interestingly, the research on hypoactive sexual desire disorder suggests that it's caused by an inability to switch off the part of the brain that's task-focused, which I think has so much correlation to the nervous system as well. And when we're in that hyper arousal kind of fight or flight mode, it's very hard to drop back into the body. And it feels a little bit simplistic, but it's interesting that there's these patterns of women being too in their heads and not being able to get into their body to really tap into their pleasure and their desire. So there's some work there in working with shame around our body and just coming to a place of reverence with the body. And again, I've personally found Tantra hugely powerful for this, because we really start to view the body as a vessel of divinity. And when you have that type of reverence for your own body, and then you're interacting with the masculine, again, to use a heteronormative paradigm, if he can't match your level of reverence for your body, then it's just not going to work. Like, we have to teach people how we want to be treated. We have to claim the space first. We have to find and hold ourselves in reverence, and then we can invite our partners to play with us in that space and to meet us there. But we have to claim it first. So working with shame, I think, is really important. And not just shame around the body, but also when we start talking about those deeper G-spot and cervical orgasms, there's a lot of letting go required to get to that place. There's a lot of vulnerability, and there's a lot of trust and surrender. And it's about kind of working through any shame or blocks to do with our emotional experience as well. We kind of need to clear these energetic channels in order to reach those places. And I really love doing this work, and I get really excited about it because I think it's very transformative when we can clear those channels and get to that place. So kind of part one of what I wanted to talk about is eliminating shame. And the second part is claiming your right to pleasure. There's kind of a pattern in our culture of women and girls having low self-worth. And I'm generalizing and being reductive here, but there's plenty of studies that prove this out. Men are more prone to entitlement, especially in what they want and their desire. We see male desire depicted much more frequently. I think when we can really stand in a place where we go, no, I'm entitled to pleasure, and I'm entitled to a lot of pleasure. When I talk about flipping the orgasm gap, I think that women should be having 3 or 5 or 10 or 20 orgasms to everyone that their male partner is having, because when you get to this place, it's actually more pleasurable for everyone. And men can cultivate sexual stamina, and men can actually learn to orgasm without ejaculating too. Like, there's work to be done on both sides in order to deepen into this space of desire and really honoring female desire and creating space to explore what might be there. But for women, when we're self-effacing all the time and we're denying ourselves, and we deny ourselves pleasure in all sorts of ways. So you can start to reclaim pleasure in just slowing down and sitting in the sun with your eyes closed and feeling the sun on your face, or putting a beautiful woolen jumper on and enjoying the feeling of it against your skin, or moisturizing yourself all over your body when you get out of the shower. Like, just taking the time to claim these moments of pleasure can really have big ripple effects into the way that we navigate pleasure sexually as well. So there it is, female desire. If you want to go deeper with me, I would love you to sign up for my mailing list. This is where I share more in-depth insights and long-form writing, and you can do that at my website, madelineeliza.com. And thank you for joining me, and I will look forward to seeing you next time.